Tonight, we're going to talk about one of the most extraordinary networks of trade, culture, and human ambition that the world has ever seen. A sprawling web of routes stretching from the imperial courts of ancient China all the way to the marble halls of Rome, and later Constantinople, and later still Venice. A ribbon of dust, hoof prints, and camel bells that carried more than just silk. It carried religions, languages, diseases, technologies, and ideas. It shaped empires, toppled kingdoms, and knitted together civilizations that would otherwise never have known one another existed. We are, of course, talking about the Silk Road, and we're going to be spending the next couple of hours together taking a nice, slow, gentle walk through 1,500 years of its history. Now, this isn't going to be one of those breathless, action-packed retellings. No, no. This is a sleep documentary after all, so we're going to take our time. We're going to linger. We're going to pause at the caravanserais and rest our weary feet. We'll listen to the wind blow across the Taklamakan Desert. We'll sit in Samarkand's markets and watch the traders haggle over lapis lazuli and spices. And by the time we're done, we'll have journeyed from the reign of the Han Emperor Wu in the 2nd century before the Common Era, all the way to the twilight of the overland routes in the 15th century, when Portuguese ships began to make the sea lanes the preferred highway of commerce. That's roughly 1,500 years, give or take a century here or there, of continuous, interconnected human enterprise. Now, before we saddle up the camels and begin, allow me to welcome you to the channel. It is good manners, after all, to do so. If you're new here, or you haven't yet clicked that subscribe button, I invite you to do so if you feel so inclined. This video, along with all the videos on this channel, and you can find the playlists for them, is completely ad-free. You'll listen through the whole thing without a single interruption. No shouting sponsor reads jolting you awake at 3 in the morning. No cutaways to some app you'll never download. Just my voice and the story all the way through. This is only possible because of the incredibly generous contributions of those on Patreon, those on YouTube memberships, those who wandered over to the merch store out of curiosity or genuine interest, and those who send the occasional donation, whether through super thanks or through PayPal. They are the reason this channel exists in its current form, and we have them to thank for that. If you would like to join that prestigious group of supporters, you need only look in the pinned comment or in the video description or in the channel description. You'll find your way easily enough. Now, with all of that lovely business out of the way, and in keeping with our theme of good manners, let us begin nice and slow. 1,500 years of Silk Road history. We start, as so many great stories do, with a problem that needed solving. The year was around 138 BCE. The place was Chang'an, the magnificent capital of the Han dynasty, seated in what is today the province of Shanxi in central China. And on the throne sat one of the most ambitious and formidable emperors that China would ever produce. His name was Emperor Wu of Han, though his personal name was Liu Qi. He had come to power at the tender age of 15, and by the time we meet him in the pages of our story, he was a man in his late 20s who was staring down a problem that had haunted his dynasty for decades. That problem had a name, and that name was the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a confederation of nomadic peoples who ranged across the vast steppes north of China. Fierce horsemen, expert archers, they had been raiding Chinese frontier settlements for generations. And they had grown so powerful that earlier Han emperors had been forced into humiliating treaties, sending princesses and silk and grain as tribute just to keep the peace. Emperor Wu, however, was not the sort of man who was comfortable paying tribute to anyone. He wanted to break the Xiongnu once and for all, and to do that, he needed allies. Word had reached the Han court that far to the west, beyond the deserts and mountains that formed the natural western boundary of the Chinese world, there was another people who hated the Xiongnu as much as the Chinese did. These were the Yuezhi, a tribe that had once lived on the borders of China, but had been driven westward by Xiongnu attacks. Their king, it was said, had been killed by the Xiongnu, and his skull had been turned into a drinking cup. Now, if that isn't motivation for revenge, I don't know what is. Emperor Wu reasoned that if he could find these Yuezhi and forge an alliance with them, the Xiongnu could be crushed between the two powers like a nut in a nutcracker. The problem was that nobody in the Han court had any real idea where the Yuezhi actually were. somewhere out west, sure. But west was a very big place, and getting there meant crossing thousands of miles of hostile territory, including lands controlled by the very Xiongnu the emperor wished to defeat. So Emperor Wu did what emperors do. He called for a volunteer. And by volunteer, of course, I mean he offered the job to a minor palace official, and if the fellow had any sense, he took it. That fellow's name was Zhang Qian. Now Zhang Qian is one of those historical figures whose name isn't widely known outside of scholarly circles, but who genuinely deserves to be counted among the great explorers of human history. He set off from Chang'an in around 138 BCE with a retinue of about 100 men and a Xiongnu slave named Ganfu, who acted as guide and interpreter. And almost immediately, things went wrong. The party was captured by the Xiongnu, which is not the sort of thing you want to happen when the Xiongnu are the people you're trying to conspire against. Now, remarkably, they weren't executed. The Xiongnu chieftain, apparently amused or curious about this Chinese delegation, decided to keep Zhang Qian as a sort of honored prisoner. He was given a wife, a Xiongnu woman, and he had children with her. And for the next 10 years, mind you, Zhang Qian lived among the Xiongnu, learning their language, their customs, their strengths, and their weaknesses. And all the while, he never let go of his original mission. He kept, we are told, the imperial credentials, the token of authority given to him by Emperor Wu, hidden away, waiting for the day he could resume his journey. That day eventually came. Around 128 BCE, Zhang Qian saw his chance and escaped, along with his wife, his children, and the faithful Ganfu. And rather than fleeing back east towards safety in China, he pressed on westward, determined to complete the task the emperor had given him. He crossed the Pamir Mountains, one of the most fearsome ranges in Asia, and he eventually did find the Yuezhi. They had settled in a region called Bactria, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. But here Zhang Qian found himself thwarted by an unexpected difficulty. The Yuezhi had grown comfortable. They had good land, prosperous cities, they enjoyed a settled agricultural life, and they had absolutely no interest in going to war with the Xiongnu, no matter how many skulls had been turned into drinking cups. The diplomatic mission, in that sense, was a total failure. But what Zhang Qian brought back to Emperor Wu when he finally returned to Chang'an in 125 BCE, after another Xiongnu captivity and another escape, mind you, was worth far more than a military alliance. He brought back knowledge, descriptions of civilizations the Chinese had never even suspected existed. Fergana with its famous heavenly horses, powerful animals that seemed to sweat blood. Sogdia with its wealthy merchant cities. Parthia, an enormous empire to the west, whose people used silver coins, stamped with the faces of their kings. And beyond even Parthia, rumors of a place called De Qin, which many historians now believe to have been the Roman Empire itself. Emperor Wu was fascinated, absolutely fascinated, and his interest was not merely academic. He grasped very quickly the strategic and commercial possibilities that Zhang Qian's report opened up. If Chinese merchants could reach these Western lands, and if Western goods could flow into China, the potential wealth was staggering. And so, in the years that followed, Emperor Wu sent further embassies westward, expanded Chinese military control into the Tarim Basin, that great oval-shaped depression ringed by mountains that lay between China proper and the true West, and he began the long process of establishing garrisoned outposts along what would become the eastern stretches of the Silk Road. This, then, is our beginning. Not with silk itself, not with camels laden with treasure, not with the great cities of Central Asia in their splendor, but with a diplomat locked in a Xiongnu tent for a decade, dreaming of a mission he had almost given up on. It's a curious thing, isn't it, how history so often turns on the stubbornness of one individual person. Had Zhang Qian broken, had he abandoned his credentials and settled quietly into Xiongnu life, the Silk Road, as we know it, might never have opened. Or perhaps it would have, eventually, through other means. History has a way of finding its channels, like water finding its way down a hillside. But the specific shape of what did happen, that was Zhang Qian's shape. That was the shape a stubborn-hand diplomat gave to the map of the world. And once the door was opened, oh my friends, once the door was opened, it did not close again for a very, very long time. The decades following Zhang Qian's return saw Emperor Wu act on the intelligence he had been given with the ruthless efficiency that characterized his long reign. He was, if nothing else, a man who understood that opportunity, once glimpsed, must be seized quickly, lest it slip away into the mist of what might have been. And so, throughout the closing decades of the 2nd century BCE, the Han dynasty poured resources into securing the western frontier and establishing what would become the eastern trunk of the great trade network. The first great obstacle, of course, remained the Xiongnu. As long as those fierce horsemen controlled the Hexi Corridor, that narrow strip of arable land that runs like a bottleneck between the Gobi Desert to the north and the Kilian Mountains to the south, no Chinese caravan could pass safely westward. And so Emperor Wu launched a series of military campaigns of astonishing scope and ambition. The general Hu Kuobang, a young man of remarkable talent who died tragically at the age of just 23, led lightning raids deep into Xiongnu territory. His cousin, the General Wei Qing, coordinated larger campaigns. Between them, they broke the back of Xiongnu power in the region. By around 121 BCE, the Hexi Corridor was in Chinese hands, and a string of fortified commanderies had been established along its length, names that would echo through the centuries. Wuwei, meaning martial might, Zhangai, meaning outstretched arm, Jiuquan, meaning wine spring, and finally Dunhuang, the great oasis city that would become the true gateway between China and the West. Now, Dunhuang deserves a moment of our attention because it is a place that we will return to many times in our journey. Sitting at the western end of the Hexi Corridor, it was the last major Chinese settlement before the terrifying expanse of the Taklamakan Desert. Beyond Dunhuang, the road split. To the north, it skirted along the edge of the desert past oasis towns like Turfan and Kucha. To the south, it hugged the base of the Kunlun Mountains, passing through Meran and Cotton. And travelers would choose their route based on the season, the political situation, and frankly, their own personal preferences, some of which came down to little more than which oasis had the better food and lodging that particular year. But no matter which route a merchant took, if they were coming from the east, they had passed through Dunhuang first. And if they were coming from the west, Dunhuang was the first true taste of China they would experience. The name Taklamakan itself, in the local Uyghur language, is said by some to mean place of no return, though scholars quibble about the exact etymology. Whatever the origin of the name, the meaning was clear enough to any traveler who gazed across its sea of shifting sand dunes. It is one of the most inhospitable places on the surface of the earth. Summer temperatures can soar above 50 degrees Celsius, and winter nights plunge well below freezing. There is almost no rainfall, and what water does exist is usually undrinkable due to high mineral content. Sandstorms can rise up with terrifying suddenness, burying entire caravans and leaving no trace of them ever having existed. Ancient travelers spoke of hearing voices in the desert, ghostly whispers that would lead unwary men off the trail and to their deaths. Modern geologists shrug and attribute these to the sound of sand shifting on dunes and the peculiar acoustic properties of vast open spaces. But I suspect that if you were alone out there at night, with your camels asleep and your fire dying, you might find the geological explanation somewhat unsatisfying. And yet, despite all of this, men went. Season after season, year after year, they went. Because on the other side of the desert lay wealth beyond imagining. Now, this is the point at which we should probably talk about silk itself, because it gives its name to the whole enterprise, doesn't it? The Silk Road. And yet silk was only ever one commodity among many. But it was, perhaps, the commodity that captured the Western imagination more than any other. So let us take a moment to consider it. Silk, as most of us know, is produced by the larvae of the silkworm, Bombyx mori, which feed exclusively on the leaves of the white mulberry tree. When the larva is ready to pupate, it spins itself a cocoon out of a single continuous filament of silk, which can be up to 900 meters long. If you unwind that filament very carefully before the moth emerges and breaks it, and if you combine several of them together, you get a thread of astonishing strength and lightness that takes dye beautifully and shimmers with a luster that no other fabric of the ancient world could match. Chinese silk production dates back at least to the 3rd millennium BCE and possibly earlier. Legend attributes its discovery to Lizu, the wife of the mythical Yellow Emperor, who is said to have been sitting under a mulberry tree drinking tea when a silkworm cocoon fell into her cup. Upon fishing it out, she found that the hot water had loosened the filament, and she could unwind it. Well, it's a lovely story, though probably not literally true. What is true is that by the time of the Han Dynasty, Chinese silk production was a highly sophisticated industry, and the techniques of sericulture, that is, the raising of silkworms and the harvesting of silk, were among the most closely guarded secrets in the world. Anyone caught attempting to smuggle silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China faced execution. This near monopoly would hold for centuries, and it made silk, in effect, the currency of the road. Roman authors would later complain bitterly about the drain of gold and silver from the empire to pay for this exotic Chinese fabric. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, estimated that 100 million sesterces were flowing out of Rome each year to pay for Eastern luxuries, of which silk was chief among them. Roman moralists railed against the immodesty of the fabric, which was often so fine that it appeared translucent when worn. Seneca famously complained that Roman women were dressing in wisps of nothing, though I suspect Seneca had somewhat larger complaints about Roman society than the sheerness of ladies' fashion. Emperor Tiberius even tried to ban men from wearing silk, considering it effeminate, though the ban was, as bans on fashion so often are, largely ignored. But silk was not the only commodity moving along these routes, not by a very long stretch. From China flowed lacquerware, bronze mirrors, ceramics, medicinal herbs, tea, though tea's rise to prominence came somewhat later, cinnamon, ginger, and paper. Now paper, my friends, paper is one of those quiet, unassuming inventions that changed the world more profoundly than almost any weapon or work of art. It was invented in China, traditionally credited to a court official named Kai Lun in the year 105 of the Common Era, though there is archaeological evidence of earlier forms. And it would travel westward along the Silk Road at a leisurely pace, taking hundreds of years to reach the Islamic world and hundreds more to reach Europe. But we'll come to paper's westward journey later. Moving in the other direction, from the west to the east, came a fascinating array of goods. Horses, most importantly, and especially those famed heavenly horses of Fergana, which the Chinese prized so highly that Emperor Wu launched an actual war to obtain them, the War of the Heavenly Horses in 104 to 101 BCE. Woolens, glass, wine, grapes, alfalfa, walnuts, sesame, cucumbers, and precious stones. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan was particularly prized. That deep celestial blue that would later grace the illuminated manuscripts of medieval Europe and the crown of Tutankhamun himself. Also flowing eastward were incense and myrrh from Arabia, coral from the Mediterranean, and in later centuries, cotton textiles from India. And here we come to an important point that is often missed in popular accounts of the Silk Road. It was not a single road. It was not even really a road. It was a network. A great sprawling web of paths, tracks, mountain passes, river crossings, and desert traverses that connected market to market, oasis to oasis, city to city, across thousands of miles of the Eurasian landmass. And no single merchant, or almost no single merchant, ever traveled its entire length. Instead, goods moved through it in stages, passing from hand to hand, buyer to seller, again and again. A bolt of silk that began its journey in a workshop in Chang'an might change ownership 15, 20, 30 times before it finally ended up draped across the shoulders of a senator's wife in Rome. And with each transaction, its price would rise, until the final purchaser was paying many, many times what the original weaver had received. This system of relay trade is one of the reasons why direct diplomatic contact between the great civilizations at the two ends of the road was so rare in the ancient world. The Romans knew of China. They called it Serica, the land of silk. The Chinese knew of Rome. They called it Dachin. But neither had a very clear idea of what the other was actually like, because they experienced each other only through intermediaries. Sogdian merchants, Parthian merchants, and later Persian and Arab merchants controlled the middle stretches of the road, and they had every incentive to keep the ends of the road as ignorant of one another as possible. Middlemen, after all, only remain middlemen so long as the buyer and the seller cannot meet directly. There is a fascinating episode recorded in the Chinese chronicles from the year 97 of the Common Era. The famous general and diplomat Ban Kao, who had extended Han influence deep into Central Asia, dispatched an envoy named Gan Wang with orders to reach De Qin and open direct relations. Gan Wang traveled all the way to the shores of what was probably the Persian Gulf, or possibly the Black Sea. Scholars still argue about it. And there on the coast, he was met by Parthian sailors, who told him that the sea voyage to Rome was terribly dangerous, took years, and that many travelers went mad from homesickness and died. Discouraged, Gan Wang turned back. Modern historians strongly suspect that the Parthian sailors were, shall we say, exaggerating somewhat for perfectly understandable commercial reasons. Had Gan Wang pressed on, direct Roman-Chinese contact might have been established more than 1,000 years before it actually was. But he did not press on, and the two great empires continued to know each other only as rumors. As the first century of the Common Era unfolded, the Silk Road entered what we might call its first golden age. On one end of the network sat the Han dynasty, at the height of its imperial confidence. On the other end sat the Roman Empire, likewise at the peak of its territorial extent under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian. And in between, filling that vast Central Asian space that neither Rome nor China could quite bring itself to conquer, sat a series of remarkable middle kingdoms that made the road work. And chief among these, for our purposes tonight, was the Kushan Empire. Now, the Kushans are one of those civilizations that most people, even people with a fairly good general knowledge of history, have never really heard of. And that's rather a shame, because in their heyday, roughly from the 1st century to the 3rd century of the Common Era, they controlled a vast territory that included parts of what is today Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Their capital was at various times located in Bactria, in Peshawar, and in Mathura, and they sat, quite literally, at the geographic crossroads of the ancient world. Trade routes from China, from India, from Persia, and from the Mediterranean all converged in Kushan territory, and the Kushan kings, being sensible people, taxed all of it very carefully and grew fantastically rich in the process. The Kushans are particularly interesting because of what they represent culturally. They were originally one of the branches of the Yuezhi. Yes, those same Yuezhi that Zhang Qian had gone looking for 2 centuries earlier. Having settled in Bactria, they had gradually absorbed elements of Hellenistic Greek culture that had been left there by the successors of Alexander the Great, mixed with Persian influences from the west, Indian influences from the south, and Chinese influences from the east. The result was one of the most cosmopolitan and syncretic civilizations that the ancient world would ever produce. Kushan coins were minted with inscriptions in Greek script, depicting kings with Persian-style tunics, worshipping gods drawn from Greek, Persian, Indian, and later, Buddhist pantheons. It's a numismatist's paradise, really, and it tells you everything you need to know about what the Silk Road did to the peoples who lived along it. It made them plural. It made them layered. It made them multiple things at once. And it was under Kushan patronage that one of the most important transmissions in the entire history of human civilization began to take place. That is the spread of Buddhism from India, across Central Asia, and into China. Now, Buddhism as a religious and philosophical system had emerged in northern India some 5 centuries before the Common Era, from the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, a prince who had renounced his princely life to seek understanding of the nature of suffering. By the time we meet the Kushans, Buddhism had been developing and diversifying in India for some 500 years. It had schools, it had scriptures, it had monastic communities, and it had, crucially for our story tonight, the beginnings of a missionary impulse. The greatest of the Kushan kings, a monarch named Kanishka, who reigned in roughly the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, was a great patron of Buddhism. Under his rule, monasteries flourished, great councils were held, and monks began to travel eastward with their scriptures and their teachings, following the same trade routes that were carrying silk in the opposite direction. The first Buddhist missionaries reached China during the Han Dynasty, and there is a charming, though probably legendary, story about their arrival. It is said that Emperor Ming of Han, who reigned in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, had a dream one night. In the dream, a golden man flew into his palace, radiant with light. When he asked his ministers what the dream might mean, one of them replied that there was a sage in the West, called the Buddha, who had achieved enlightenment and who often appeared as a golden figure. Intrigued, the emperor dispatched envoys westward to seek out this teaching. And in due course, they returned, along with 2 Buddhist monks named Kasyapa Matanga and Dharmaratna, riding on a white horse and carrying scriptures. And Emperor Ming built the very first Buddhist temple in China to house them, calling it the White Horse Temple. That temple, in various rebuilt forms, still stands today in the city of Luoyang. Whether the story is precisely true in every detail matters less than the fact that something like it did happen at some point in the 1st century, and that Buddhism took root in Chinese soil. The process was slow. Buddhism did not sweep across China overnight, and for the first few centuries, it remained a somewhat exotic foreign faith, practiced mostly by resident merchants from Central Asia and their Chinese converts. But over the following centuries, and especially during the turbulent period after the fall of the Han in the 3rd century of the Common Era, Buddhism would grow into one of the great pillars of Chinese civilization. Along the Silk Road itself, Buddhism left an extraordinary physical legacy. The great cave temple complexes at places like Bezeklik, Kizil, Kucha, and most famously at Dunhuang and at Bamiyan, were carved out of cliff faces by generations of monks and pilgrims. They were painted with murals depicting scenes from the life of the Buddha and from the sutras, filled with statues and packed with libraries of manuscripts. These sites are among the most important archaeological treasures of Asia, and we shall return to them at various points in our tale tonight. While Buddhism was moving eastward, other things were moving too. The Roman world in the 1st and 2nd centuries was hungry for Eastern luxuries. And a substantial part of that trade, actually, did not travel overland along the Silk Road at all. It traveled by sea. This is a point that is often lost in popular retellings. The maritime routes connecting the Red Sea ports of Egypt to the Malabar coast of India, and from there onwards to Southeast Asia and even southern China, were tremendously important. A remarkable Greek text from the 1st century of the Common Era, called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes these routes in detail. It tells us about the monsoon winds and how a sailor named Hippalus had, some decades earlier, figured out how to use them to cross directly across the Indian Ocean, rather than hugging the coast. It tells us about the ports of India and what goods were traded at each. It tells us about the pepper of Malabar, which was worth its weight in silver in Rome. And it gives us the sense of a bustling, connected, commercial world that spans from the Mediterranean to the Bay of Bengal, all humming along nicely, moving goods and people and ideas. The overland Silk Road and the maritime spice route were not competitors so much as complementary systems. Some goods traveled better by camel, others by ship. Some routes were safer in some years than others, depending on which nomadic confederation was raiding which oasis, or which pirate fleet was patrolling which coast. Merchants moved between the 2 systems as circumstances dictated, and the great cities of the intermediary zones, places like Palmyra in the Syrian desert, or Petra in what is now Jordan, or the Kushan capital of Peshawar, thrived on the taxes and duties they levied on the flow of goods through their territories. Palmyra deserves a moment of attention. Rising like a mirage out of the Syrian desert at an oasis midway between the Mediterranean coast and the Euphrates River, Palmyra grew rich in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era as a caravan city par excellence. Its merchants organized expeditions all the way to the Persian Gulf, and their goods flowed on to Rome and beyond. Palmyran inscriptions have been found as far east as the mouth of the Indus. The city itself was a marvel, with colonnaded streets, temples to a fascinating mix of Semitic, Greek, and Roman gods, and a merchant aristocracy whose funerary portraits, carved in a distinctive frontal style with those large, staring eyes, still gaze out at us from museums around the world today. Palmyra's most famous moment came somewhat later, in the 3rd century, when its queen, Zenobia, briefly carved out an independent empire from the crumbling eastern provinces of Rome. But even before Zenobia's dramatic adventure, Palmyra was one of the essential nodes of the ancient trade network. Now, all of this prosperity, all of this connection, was, of course, vulnerable. And in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, a series of shocks began to disrupt the smooth functioning of the network. The Han Dynasty in China entered a period of decline, culminating in its final collapse in the year 220. What followed was the era known as the Three Kingdoms, and then the Jin Dynasty, and then a very long period of division between North and South China that lasted, in various forms, until the Great Reunification under the Sui Dynasty at the end of the 6th century. Political fragmentation in China did not stop trade entirely, but it certainly complicated it. The imperial garrisons in the Tarim Basin waxed and waned in their strength. Sometimes Chinese authority extended deep into Central Asia, and sometimes it retreated all the way back behind the Jade Gate at Dunhuang. Meanwhile, in the West, the Roman Empire entered its own period of crisis in the 3rd century. Plague, civil war, the collapse of the silver currency, and pressure from Germanic tribes on the northern frontiers all conspired to weaken Roman commerce and reduce Roman appetite for Eastern luxuries. And in the middle, the Parthian Empire, which had for centuries controlled the crucial land bridge between East and West, was overthrown in the year 224 by a new Persian dynasty, the Sasanians. The Sasanians were, in many ways, even more formidable than the Parthians. They were fiercely centralized, culturally proud, and often at war with Rome. They controlled the flow of silk through their territory very carefully, and they took a keen interest in developing their own silk production, eventually succeeding, according to some accounts, in obtaining smuggled silkworm eggs from China, though this story is more traditionally associated with the Byzantines a couple of centuries later. The 3rd century, then, was a difficult one for the Silk Road. Not a catastrophe, mind you. Trade continued. But the volumes shrank, the routes became more perilous, and the great imperial patronage that had underwritten the first golden age fell away on both ends of the network. What emerged in its place over the following centuries was something different, something that would prove, in many ways, even more culturally significant than what had come before. The centuries between roughly the year 300 and the year 600 of the Common Era are sometimes described in Western historical writing as the Dark Ages, though that term has fallen rather out of fashion these days, and rightly so, because along the length of the Silk Road, and indeed across much of Eurasia, those centuries were not dark at all. They were instead a period of profound and often bewildering transformation. Old empires fell, new peoples arrived. Religions traveled to places they had never been before and were transformed in the process. And through it all, the caravans continued to move, threading their way through changing political landscapes with the patient, methodical persistence of camels putting one foot in front of another. In China, the collapse of the Han had ushered in a long period of division. The north of China fell under the rule of a succession of dynasties founded by peoples who had originally come from the steppes. The Xianbei, the Xiongnu, the Jai, and others. These were peoples the old Han court would have dismissed as barbarians, but they proved themselves, in fact, to be perfectly capable rulers, and many of them adopted Chinese customs and administrative practices with enthusiasm. The Northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Chuoba branch of the Xianbei people, is a particularly interesting example. Under emperors like Xiaoran, who reigned in the late 5th century, the Northern Wei deliberately Sinicized themselves, adopting Chinese dress, Chinese names, and Chinese administrative structures. And they became, incidentally, some of the greatest patrons of Buddhist art in the entire history of the world. It was under Northern Wei patronage that the great cave temple complex at Yungang was begun, near the city of Datong. And it was later, after the Northern Wei moved their capital south to Luoyang in the year 494, that they commenced the extraordinary Longmen grottos, carved into the cliffs along the Yi River. These sites contain tens of thousands of Buddhist statues, ranging from tiny figurines just a few centimeters tall to colossal Buddhas nearly 20 meters high. They represent a fusion of Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese artistic traditions that could only have happened along the Silk Road. The rounded forms and heavy drapery of the Gandharan Buddhist tradition, which itself had emerged in the Kushan territories from a fusion of Greek and Indian influences, traveled east along the trade routes and found new expression in the hands of Chinese sculptors, who gave the figures their own distinctive faces, their own distinctive gestures, and their own distinctive spiritual sensibility. Meanwhile, at Dunhuang, at the western gate of China, another cave temple complex was expanding steadily. The Mogao Caves, sometimes called the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas, had been begun, according to tradition, in the year 366, when a wandering monk named Yuizhan had a vision of 1,000 golden Buddhas at that site and began to carve the first cave. Over the following 1,000 years, generation after generation of monks, pilgrims, and wealthy patrons would fund the excavation and decoration of new caves. By the time the process wound down in the 14th century, there were nearly 500 decorated caves at Dunhuang, containing thousands of statues and covering an estimated 45,000 square meters of wall paintings. It is one of the greatest treasure houses of religious art anywhere in the world, and we will have much more to say about it when we come to a certain remarkable discovery made there at the beginning of the 20th century. But for now, let us simply note that Dunhuang, and places like it, functioned as spiritual service stations along the road. Merchants stopping at Dunhuang would fund the carving of a cave or the painting of a mural, hopping thereby to earn merit for a safe journey or to give thanks for a profitable one just completed. Buddhism during these centuries continued to move eastward, but something else was happening too. Chinese pilgrims were beginning to travel westward, back along the Silk Road, in search of the pure teachings and the original scriptures of their faith. The most famous of these pilgrim monks is probably Xuanzang, who lived in the 7th century, but he was preceded by others whose journeys were equally remarkable. Faxian, who set out from Chang'an in the year 399 at the age of nearly 60, mind you, traveled all the way to India, spent years studying at the great monasteries there, and returned by sea after 15 years of travel. He wrote an account of his journey that survives to this day, and it gives us one of our best windows into the Buddhist civilization of Central Asia and India at that time. Faxian described the great monasteries of Khotan, where he watched a procession in which images of the Buddha were paraded through the streets on ornate wheeled carriages. He described the ruins of ancient cities in the Taklamakan. He described the terror of crossing the Pamirs, where he said, the mountains were so high that travelers experienced difficulty breathing, and where the paths were so narrow that a single misstep meant death in the gorges below. Faxian's account also gives us a poignant sense of the strangeness of these journeys. When he finally returned to China after 15 years abroad, he found that the political situation had changed completely. The dynasty that had ruled when he departed had fallen. His teachers and colleagues at his home monastery were mostly dead. He was, in a sense, a stranger in his own homeland, carrying with him precious scriptures in languages that few in China could yet read. He spent the remainder of his life translating them into Chinese, adding to the growing corpus of Buddhist literature that was reshaping Chinese religious thought. Now, while Buddhism was making its long journey eastward, other religious traditions were also traveling the Silk Road, sometimes in directions we might not expect. Nestorian Christianity, for example, that branch of the Christian faith which had been declared heretical by the mainstream church at the Council of Ephesus in the year 431, found itself, in effect, exiled to the east. And the Nestorians, deprived of any comfortable homeland in the Roman world, threw themselves into a remarkable missionary endeavor. They established churches and monasteries in Persia, in Central Asia, and eventually, remarkably, even in China itself. There is a famous stele, the Nestorian stele, erected in Chang'an in the year 781, which records in Chinese and Syriac the history of the Christian mission in China. It was buried in the 9th century during a period of religious persecution, forgotten, and then rediscovered in the 17th century, causing quite a stir among European Jesuit missionaries who were then in China and who had had no idea that Christianity had reached the country nearly 1,000 years before their own arrival. Manichaeism, too, traveled the Silk Road. Founded in the 3rd century by the Persian prophet Mani, this dualistic religion, which taught that the universe was the battleground of opposing forces of light and darkness, spread with astonishing speed across both the Roman Empire in the west and the Persian and Central Asian world in the east. It would eventually be adopted as the state religion of the Uyghur Khaganate, a Turkic empire that dominated the eastern steppes in the 8th and 9th centuries. The Uyghurs' conversion to Manichaeism is one of the most remarkable episodes of religious history in the region, and Manichaean texts and artwork have been recovered from sites all along the northern route of the Silk Road. It is one of those faiths that seems, in retrospect, to have been almost designed for the Silk Road. Portable, cosmopolitan, willing to adapt its symbols and terminology to local traditions, it could take root in almost any soil. And yet, in the end, Manichaeism did not survive. It faded away in the West under pressure from Christianity, and in the East under pressure from Buddhism and, later, Islam. Today it exists only in fragments and museum cases, a whispered memory of a great religion that once spanned continents. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian faith of the fire temples, also traveled the road. Zoroastrian communities were established in the great cities of Central Asia, and even in China, where they were known as followers of the religion of the celestial god, and where their temples served the resident Persian merchant communities. And Judaism, too, moved along the road, with Jewish merchants known to have been active in Central Asia and in China from a very early period. A small Jewish community would exist in the Chinese city of Kaifeng for nearly 1,000 years, and their story is one of the more fascinating footnotes to Silk Road history. But of all these religious travelers, none would prove more consequential in the long run than the last great faith to emerge in this era, a faith whose spread would transform not just the middle stretches of the Silk Road, but the entire cultural geography of Eurasia. I am, of course, speaking of Islam. Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century of the Common Era, with the revelations received by the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca and Medina between the years 610 and 632. And within a single generation of the Prophet's death, Arab armies inspired by their new faith had burst out of Arabia and shattered the two great empires of the region. The Sasanian-Persian Empire was destroyed entirely, its last emperor pursued and killed in the year 651. The Byzantine Empire, though it survived, lost its wealthiest provinces of Egypt, Syria, and eventually North Africa, and the Arabs, having conquered Persia, kept on going eastward. By the year 715, Arab forces had reached the borders of China and had established Islamic rule across Central Asia in the great cities of Bokhara, Samarkand, and beyond. The consequences of this for the Silk Road were profound. On the one hand, the Arab conquests initially disrupted trade very significantly, as conquest wars always do. On the other hand, once the dust had settled and the new political geography had stabilized, the Islamic Caliphate provided something the Silk Road had not enjoyed since the height of the Parthian era: a single, unified, tolerant, and commercially minded political authority stretching from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the borders of China. Merchants could travel enormous distances under a single legal system, using a single language of commerce, that is Arabic, and worshipping in mosques that could be found in every major town from Cordoba to Kashgar. This was an extraordinary development, and it would set the stage for what many historians consider to have been the true golden age of the Silk Road, an age that would flourish in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and at the eastern end under the resurgent Chinese Empire of the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty of China, which ruled from the year 618 to the year 907, is often described by Chinese historians as the Great Cosmopolitan Dynasty, and that description, I think, is a fair one. Under emperors like Taizong and Xuanzong, The Tang court presided over what was arguably the most sophisticated, wealthy, and outward-looking society on the entire face of the earth. And its capital city of Chang'an, which sat at the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, was the largest city in the world at that time, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million people. That is an astonishing figure for the 7th and 8th centuries. Rome, at its imperial height, had never quite reached that number. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, was a fraction of the size. Chang'an, under the Tang, was in a class of its own. And within its walls, one could find peoples from every corner of the known world. There were Sogdian merchants from Central Asia, tall men with pointed beards and colorful silk robes, who dominated much of the caravan trade. There were Persians, some of them refugees from the Sasanian collapse, who had brought with them the arts of metalwork, of jewelry, and of music. There were Arabs, arriving both as traders and as diplomatic envoys from the newly established caliphate. There were Turks and Uyghurs from the steppes, Tibetans from the high plateau, Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese, Indians, and even from time to time, a stray Nestorian priest from as far away as Syria. The Tang authorities established special quarters for these foreign communities within Chang'an and permitted them to worship in their own temples, churches, and mosques. There was a Zoroastrian fire temple in the Western Market. There was a Nestorian Christian monastery near the palace. And from the 7th century onwards, there were mosques serving the growing Muslim community of merchants and their families. The Tang taste for foreign things was remarkable, and it reached deep into the culture. Aristocratic ladies rode horses, played polo, and wore Central Asian styles of dress with turned-back collars and tight bodices. Tang poets wrote verses about the exotic dancers who came to Chang'an from Samarkand and Bokhara. Tang musicians adopted instruments from Central Asia, including the pipa, that pear-shaped lute which had originally come from Persia. Tang potters produced those famous three-colored glazed ceramics, the Sankai wares, which often depicted foreigners, camels, and horses in beautifully observed detail. A tomb from the Tang era, when opened by modern archaeologists, will very often yield a little ceramic figure of a bearded Sogdian merchant leading a laden Bactrian camel, its head thrown back in a bellow, its double humps neatly modeled. These pieces are among the most charming artifacts to have come down to us from any ancient civilization, and they capture something essential about the spirit of the age. This was a China that looked outward with curiosity rather than inward with suspicion. The greatest of all the Tang pilgrim monks traveled during this era. I mentioned him briefly in our last section. His name was Xuanzang, and his journey to India, undertaken between the years 629 and 645, is one of the truly great adventures of world history. Xuanzang left Chang'an in defiance of an imperial ban on travel westward, which was in force at that time due to political tensions with the Turkic Khaganate. He slipped past the frontier garrisons, crossed the terrifying western reaches of the Gobi Desert, and made his way to the great oasis cities of the Tarim Basin. In Turfan, the local Buddhist king was so impressed by Xuanzang's learning and piety that he tried to keep him there permanently as a court chaplain. Xuanzang refused, going so far as to threaten a hunger strike, and the king eventually relented, providing him instead with guides, supplies, and letters of introduction that would ease his passage across Central Asia. Xuanzang crossed the Tian Shan, the Celestial Mountains, in the depths of winter. He lost a third of his party to cold and avalanches in those crossings. He passed through Siab, the Turkic capital in what is today Kyrgyzstan, where he was received by the great Khan himself. He visited Samarkand, then a largely Zoroastrian city, where he was appalled to find that Buddhism had been all but extinguished. He crossed into the territory that had once been the heart of the Kushan Empire, and there, at Bamiyan, he saw the great cliff-carved Buddhas, standing 53 meters and 38 meters tall respectively, still magnificent though already somewhat weathered by time. Those Bamiyan Buddhas, alas, would be dynamited by the Taliban in the year 2001 in one of the great cultural crimes of modern history. But when Xuanzang saw them, they were still gilded and painted, and he described them in his memoirs as glowing with a brilliance that could be seen from far off. He crossed into India by way of the Khyber Pass, and there he spent more than a decade traveling from monastery to monastery, studying with the greatest Buddhist teachers of his day, learning Sanskrit, and collecting scriptures. He visited Nalanda, that vast monastic university in what is now the Indian state of Bihar, which at its height housed some 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers, drawn from all over the Buddhist world. He debated theology with the finest minds of the age, and he acquired, over the years, a truly enormous library of Buddhist manuscripts, which he was determined to bring back to China. His return journey was almost as dramatic as his outward one. He crossed back over the Pamirs, along the southern route this time, through Kashgar and Cotton. At one point, one of his elephants, laden with precious manuscripts, was swept away in a river crossing, and Xuanzang wept for the loss of those texts as if he had lost his own children. When at last he arrived back at Chang'an in the year 645, after 16 years of absence, he was met by a delegation from the emperor himself. Emperor Taizong was so impressed by Xuanzang's accomplishments that he offered him a high government post. Xuanzang refused, preferring to devote his remaining years to the translation of the 657 Buddhist texts he had brought back with him. He spent the next 20 years working with a team of translators, and the results of that work would shape Chinese Buddhism for 1,000 years to come. And there is a curious postscript to Xuanzang's story. His account of his travels, the great Tang records on the western regions, was extensively read in China for centuries. And nearly 1,000 years after his death, in the 16th century, a novelist named Wu Cheng'an took Xuanzang's journey and transformed it into a fantastical adventure, adding to it a magical monkey named Sun Wukong, a comical pig, a river spirit, and a whole host of demons and gods. The result was Journey to the West, one of the 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature and probably the most beloved of them all. If you have ever encountered the character of the Monkey King in any of the myriad films, television series, comics, and video games that draw on this material, you have Xuanzang's real historical journey to thank for it. History, sometimes, has the loveliest way of turning itself into legend. Meanwhile, at the other end of the Silk Road, another great civilization was reaching its own extraordinary peak. The Abbasid Caliphate had come to power in the year 750, overthrowing the earlier Umayyad dynasty, and had established its capital at a newly founded city called Baghdad, on the banks of the Tigris in what is today Iraq. Baghdad, under the early Abbasids, particularly under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809, became a city to rival Chang'an itself. It was a planned circular city, with the Caliph's palace at the center and radial streets extending outward, and at its height, it may have housed a population of over 500,000 people. It was a center of scholarship, of poetry, of theology, and crucially of trade. And it was in Baghdad that one of the most consequential transfers of technology in the entire history of the Silk Road took place. The story is often told as follows, though scholars debate some of the details. In the year 751, a battle took place at the Talas River, in what is today Kyrgyzstan, between an Arab army and a Chinese army sent by the Tang Emperor to reassert Chinese control over Central Asia. The Arabs won the battle decisively, and among the many Chinese prisoners taken were a number of skilled craftsmen. Among these craftsmen, or so the tradition holds, were papermakers. And these papermakers, brought back to the Abbasid Caliphate, established the first papermaking workshops in the Islamic world, first in Samarkand, then in Baghdad, and eventually across the entire Muslim world. Whether the Battle of Talas was truly the single moment of transmission, or whether papermaking had already begun to seep westward before that battle, the fact remains that within a few decades of Talas, Baghdad had become a papermaking center. And the consequences were incalculable. Paper was cheaper, more durable, and easier to work with than the papyrus or parchment that had previously been used for writing in the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean worlds. It made books cheaper. It made scholarship easier. It made administration more efficient. And it created the material foundation for what historians now call the Islamic Golden Age, that extraordinary flowering of learning that took place in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, during which scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and other great Islamic cities translated the works of the ancient Greeks into Arabic, made pioneering advances in mathematics, in astronomy, in medicine, in optics, in chemistry, and preserved for later ages a body of knowledge that would eventually be transmitted, along with paper itself, to Europe, where it would help ignite the Renaissance. None of this would have happened, or at least not in the way that it did happen, without the Silk Road. Paper was a Chinese invention. Its westward journey took nearly 7 centuries, but when it finally arrived in the Islamic world, it transformed everything. The 9th century brought difficulties to both ends of the Silk Road, though the middle continued to thrive. In China, the Tang dynasty, which had been so magnificent in its earlier years, began to fray. A catastrophic rebellion led by the general Enlil, which broke out in the year 755 and dragged on for 8 terrible years, had done enormous damage to the Tang state. Millions had died. Central government authority had been badly weakened. And of particular consequence for our story tonight, the great cosmopolitan openness that had characterized Chang'an in its heyday began to give way to a suspicious, inward-looking hostility toward foreigners and foreign religions. In the year 845, the Emperor Wuzong of Tang launched a great persecution of Buddhism, ordering the destruction of thousands of monasteries and the forced return of hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns to secular life. The persecution was directed primarily at Buddhism, which had grown enormously wealthy and was seen as economically parasitic on the state, but it swept up other foreign faiths in its net as well. Nestorian Christianity, Manichaeism, and Zoroastrianism all suffered under the same edicts. The wonderful religious diversity that had characterized Tang China went, more or less, into permanent retreat. The Tang itself would totter on for another 60 years or so after Wuzong's persecution, but its great days were behind it. The dynasty finally fell in the year 907, and what followed was a period of division known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, during which China was fragmented among competing warlord regimes. Trade continued, of course. Trade almost always continues in some form. But the volumes shrank, and the great imperial patronage of the caravan routes fell away. Meanwhile, the Abbasid Caliphate in the west was also entering a period of gradual decline. The vast territory that the early caliphs had ruled proved impossible to hold together indefinitely. Local dynasties began to break away, or to rule effectively independently while offering only nominal allegiance to the caliph in Baghdad. The Samanids emerged in Central Asia, ruling from Bokhara. The Fatimids established a rival caliphate in Egypt. The Buyids seized effective power in Baghdad itself, reducing the caliph to a ceremonial figure. But, and here is the crucial point, this political fragmentation did not necessarily mean commercial decline. In many ways, the smaller successor states were even more focused on trade than the great caliphate had been. Bokhara and Samarkand under the Samanids were among the most brilliant cities of the medieval world. Poets, scholars, and merchants flocked to them. It was under Samanid patronage that the great Persian scientist Ibn Sina, known to the Latin West as Avicenna, received his education. And it was in the Samanid domains that Persian, having been largely displaced by Arabic in the previous centuries, made its remarkable comeback as a language of literature and learning. The 10th century, then, saw a shift in the political geography of the Silk Road without any collapse of the road itself. And it also saw the arrival of new players from the north. Turkic peoples, who had for centuries lived on the steppes north of the Islamic world and east of the Chinese frontier, began to move southward and westward in ever greater numbers. Some came as slaves, purchased for military service. The Abbasid caliphs and their successors had long relied on Turkic slave soldiers, called Ghilman or Mamluks, and these soldiers, being effective and loyal to their masters rather than to any local faction, had gradually become the backbone of Islamic armies. Others came as free warriors, migrating with their families and their flocks, converting to Islam as they went, and carving out kingdoms of their own. And by the middle of the 11th century, a new Turkic dynasty, the Seljuks, had swept out of Central Asia and established an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the borders of the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuk arrival is one of those pivotal moments that historians love to point at, because it set in motion a cascade of consequences that would reshape the medieval world. The Seljuk defeat of a Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in the year 1071 opened Anatolia, that is, modern Turkey, to Turkish settlement, transforming what had been a Greek-speaking Christian heartland into what would eventually become the Turkish heartland. The Byzantine emperor's subsequent appeal to the Pope for military assistance would eventually help provoke the First Crusade in 1095. And the Crusades themselves, whatever we may think of them morally, would have profound economic consequences, bringing Western European merchants into direct contact with the Eastern Mediterranean, and through it with the Silk Road system. The Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa would grow fabulously rich on the Crusader trade, establishing merchant colonies in ports like Acre, Antioch, and Constantinople, and beginning that long, slow process by which Western Europe would eventually rise from being a peripheral backwater of Eurasian civilization to becoming, some centuries later, its dominant commercial power. But we are getting somewhat ahead of ourselves. Let us pause here and take stock of the middle of the 11th century, and let us wander for a moment through some of the great cities of the Silk Road at that time, because they are worth lingering over. Bokhara. It sits in what is today Uzbekistan, in the fertile oasis of the Zeravshan River. Under the Samanids, and then the Karakhanids, it was known throughout the Islamic world as the Noble Bokhara, and it was said to have more scholars per square meter than any other city on earth. Its bazaars were fragrant with the smell of spices and dyed silks. Its madrasas hummed with the murmur of students memorizing verses of the Quran, and its many hundreds of mosques called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. The Kalyan Minaret, which still stands today, rising 47 meters into the sky above the old city, was built somewhat later, in the 12th century, but even in the 11th, Bokhara was a place of extraordinary architectural sophistication. Its ceramicists produced tiles of the most exquisite turquoise and cobalt. Its silk weavers made textiles that competed with the finest Chinese silks in the markets of Baghdad. And its intellectual life was such that a young man born in a nearby village, whose father was a minor official, could find his way to the royal library, read voraciously, and grow up to become Avicenna, one of the greatest polymaths that the human species has ever produced. Samarkand. It sits about 200 kilometers to the east of Bokhara, along the same river, and it is, if anything, an even more storied city. Alexander the Great had captured it in 329 before the Common Era, and it was said that when he saw it, he declared, "Everything I have heard about Marakanda is true, except that it is more beautiful than I could have imagined." It sat at a genuine crossroads. From Samarkand, roads led north to the Turkic steppes, east across the Pamirs to China, south through the Iron Gate to India, and west across the plateau to Persia and beyond. Its markets were, in effect, the trading floor for a substantial portion of the entire Silk Road, and its people, the Sogdians and their successors, had for centuries been the most active caravan traders on the road. Sogdian communities could be found in Changan, in Merv, in Tashkent, and even, in earlier centuries, in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. They spoke a language derived from Middle Iranian, they wrote in a distinctive script, and they carried with them wherever they went a talent for languages and commerce that made them the great intermediaries of the Silk Road. By the 11th century, the Sogdians had largely been absorbed into the broader Turkic and Persian populations of the region, but the traditions of Samarkandi commerce remained. Merv. Sitting in what is today Turkmenistan, at another oasis, watered by the Murgab River, Merv was, in the 11th and 12th centuries, one of the largest cities in the world. Under the Seljuks, it became briefly an imperial capital, and its population may have reached 500,000. Contemporary Arab geographers described its wonders in loving detail. Its libraries, of which there were said to be 10, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, its cotton and silk industries, its bazaars, its gardens, its citadel. Merv, unlike Bokhara or Samarkand, does not really exist today. It was destroyed with such completeness in the 13th century by an event we shall come to shortly that it never recovered. The ruins of medieval Merv sprawl across an enormous area, and walking among them today, one gets a haunting sense of just how great this city once was, and how thoroughly it can be undone. Kashgar. Sitting on the western edge of the Tarim Basin, at the point where the routes from Samarkand and from the Fergana Valley converge before splitting again around the Taklamakan, Kashgar was the great gateway between the Islamic world and China. It had converted to Islam relatively early, in the 10th century, under the Karakhanid dynasty, and it had become an important center of Islamic learning, home to scholars like Mahmud al-Kashgari, whose great compendium of the Turkic language, written in the 11th century, remains one of our most important sources for the history of Turkic peoples. Kashgar's Sunday Bazaar, which continued to function into modern times, was one of the great sights of Central Asia. Merchants gathered there from every direction, bringing horses from Fergana, jade from cotton, silks from China, spices from India, and manufactured goods from Persia. The city had a distinctly frontier character, poised as it was between the Islamic and the non-Islamic worlds, and its merchants were fluent in the arts of navigating between multiple cultural systems. And then there was Kaifeng. This was the great capital of Song dynasty China, which had unified the country in the year 960 after the long period of division that had followed the Tang collapse. Kaifeng sat in the North China Plain, on the Grand Canal, and by the 11th century it had grown into a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, rivaling or exceeding Chang'an at its peak. But Kaifeng was a different sort of city from Chang'an. It was more commercial, less imperial. Its markets operated day and night, without the strict curfews that had regulated Chang'an. Its streets were lined with shops and restaurants and tea-houses and pleasure quarters. And it was in Song dynasty China, in cities like Kaifeng, that a whole series of technologies emerged that would eventually reshape the world. The magnetic compass, gunpowder movable type printing, and vastly improved shipbuilding techniques were all developed or perfected during the Song era. And all of them, in due course, would travel westward along the Silk Road, bringing with them consequences that no one at the time could have foreseen. The Silk Road in the 11th century was not what it had been in the great days of Tang and Abbasid patronage, but it was still, in its own way, immensely vital. The 12th century wound its way onward in relative continuity with what had come before. The Seljuks weakened, breaking into competing sultanates. The Song dynasty in China lost its northern territories in the year 1127 to the Jurchen people, who established the Jin dynasty in the north, forcing the Song court to flee south and establish a new capital at Hangzhou. The Islamic world remained a patchwork of competing dynasties and emirates. And through it all, the caravans continued to move, though perhaps with a little more caution than in previous eras, given the general political fragmentation. But then, in the early years of the 13th century, something happened on the eastern steppes that would change absolutely everything. Something that would sweep through Asia and Europe like a great wave, destroying much and, paradoxically, creating conditions for a Silk Road unification unlike anything the world had ever seen. I am speaking, of course, of the rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. The story of Genghis Khan is one of those stories that seems almost too dramatic to be historical. He was born, we believe, in the year 1162, though the exact date is disputed, in a Mongol clan called the Borjigin, on the steppes north of the Gobi Desert. His birth name was Temujin. His father, a minor clan leader, was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was just 9 years old, leaving the family destitute. Temujin's early years were spent in genuine poverty, with his mother, his siblings, and himself scraping by on wild roots and fish caught from the streams of the steppe. He was captured and enslaved at least once as a young man. He watched his young wife be abducted by an enemy clan. He escaped, gathered allies, rescued her, and then, over the following decades, in one of the most remarkable political and military ascents in human history, he built a coalition that united all the warring Mongol clans under his personal leadership. By the year 1206, when a great assembly of the Mongol chieftains proclaimed him Genghis Khan, meaning oceanic ruler or universal ruler, he was the undisputed master of all the peoples of the Mongolian steppe. And having unified the steppe, he turned outward. The Mongol conquests that followed over the next several decades are among the most consequential military campaigns in world history. In 1209, the Mongols attacked the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia, which controlled the eastern reaches of the Silk Road and the Gansu Corridor. In 1211, they turned on the Jin dynasty of northern China, beginning a war that would eventually end with the complete conquest of that state. In 1219, provoked by the murder of a Mongol trade caravan by the governor of Otrar in the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan launched a campaign westward that would leave the entire Islamic East in ruins. The Khwarezmian Shah, who had grown fat and complacent on his control of the Middle Silk Road, was pursued to his death on an island in the Caspian Sea. His empire, which had encompassed most of Central Asia and Persia, ceased to exist. Its great cities, Otrar, Bokhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, were sacked, one after another, with a thoroughness and a brutality that has haunted the historical memory of the region ever since. The destruction of Merv in the year 1221 is perhaps the most famous example. When the Mongols under Genghis Khan's youngest son, Tolui, entered the city after a siege, they systematically massacred the population. Contemporary Persian chroniclers, admittedly not the most objective of sources, claimed casualty figures in the hundreds of thousands or even over 1 million. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, and there is general agreement that these figures are exaggerated. But even if we reduce them substantially, the killing was on a scale that beggars comprehension. Merv did not recover. The great libraries, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, were burned. The irrigation systems, which had made the oasis flourish for centuries, were destroyed. The population, or what remained of it, was scattered. And Merv, that great city that had once rivaled Baghdad, dwindled into a ruin. Nishapur, further south, met a similar fate. So did Balkh. So did Samarkand, though its destruction was somewhat less complete, and it would eventually recover under later rulers. Bokhara was famously entered by Genghis Khan in person, and there is a story, whether true or apocryphal, that he rode his horse into the great mosque and, gesturing to the terrified imams and scholars, declared himself to be the punishment of God, sent to chastise them for their sins. Whether he said those exact words or not, the meaning of his arrival was clear enough. Genghis Khan died in the year 1227 in the midst of a campaign against the Tanguts. His death, according to Mongol tradition, was kept secret until the campaign could be concluded and the news brought back to the family. His empire was divided among his 4 sons, but it continued to expand under their leadership. Ojdeh, his 3rd son, became the 2nd Great Khan and completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty of northern China. Batu, a grandson through the eldest son Joche, led a great campaign westward that shattered the Russian principalities and reached deep into Poland and Hungary before being called back to Mongolia by dynastic politics. Hulagu, another grandson, led the campaign that would deal a final blow to the traditional heart of the Islamic world. In the year 1258, Hulagu's armies sacked Baghdad. The last Abbasid caliph, al-Mustasim, was captured and, according to tradition, wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, in accordance with a Mongol belief that royal blood should not be spilled directly on the ground. The great libraries of Baghdad were thrown into the Tigris, and it was said that the river ran black with the ink of manuscripts for days. The 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate, which had presided over the Islamic Golden Age, was extinguished. Now, if this were all we had to say about the Mongols, our story would be a very sad one indeed. But it is not all. And here is where things become genuinely interesting. Because after the initial waves of conquest were complete, the Mongols proved themselves to be surprisingly effective and, in some ways, remarkably enlightened rulers. Having conquered the largest contiguous land empire in world history, stretching from Korea in the east to Poland in the west, they set about, quite consciously, restoring and expanding the trade networks that their conquests had temporarily disrupted. And the era that followed, from roughly the middle of the 13th century to the middle of the 14th, is what historians now call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. It was, arguably, the true golden age of the Silk Road. Under the Pax Mongolica, a merchant could travel from the coast of the Yellow Sea to the shores of the Black Sea, some 6,000 kilometers under a single overarching political authority. There were no borders to cross, no customs houses to bribe, no bandits to fear, or at least far fewer of them than in previous eras. The Mongols established a system of relay stations, called yams, at regular intervals along the major roads, where imperial couriers could exchange horses and where merchants could find lodging, provisions, and protection. This yam system, which extended across the entire empire, was one of the great administrative achievements of the medieval world. A message from the great Khan in Karakoram, or later in Beijing, could reach the Persian court at Tabriz in a matter of weeks. Trade goods moved with unprecedented speed and security, and crucially, so did people and ideas. It was during the Pax Mongolica that the most famous of all Silk Road travelers made his journey. Marco Polo, born in the year 1254 in Venice, was the son of a Venetian merchant named Niccolo Polo, who, together with his brother Maffei, had already made one journey to the Mongol court and back. In the year 1271, when Marco was 17 years old, his father and uncle set off on a second journey, taking the young Marco with them. They traveled overland across Anatolia, through Persia, across the Pamirs, along the southern route of the Silk Road through Kashgar, Khotan, and the Taklamakan, and finally, after 3.5 years of travel, they arrived at the summer capital of the great Khan Kublai, grandson of Genghis Khan, at Shangdu, the fabled Xanadu of later English poetry. Marco Polo, if his own account is to be believed, spent the next 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, traveling extensively throughout the Mongol Empire on various diplomatic and administrative missions. He described cities of a wealth and sophistication that his European contemporaries found difficult to credit. Hangzhou, the former Song capital, which the Mongols had captured only a few years before Marco's arrival, he described as the finest and noblest city in the world, with its 12,000 stone bridges, its 10 great squares, its markets that were held 3 times a week and attracted 40 to 50,000 people each time. He described the paper money that the Mongols used in China, a concept that seemed utterly bizarre to a European accustomed to gold and silver coins. He described the use of coal for heating, which was likewise unknown in Europe. He described the imperial postal system, the great palaces, the pleasure gardens, the trade fleets that sailed to Java and to India. The Polos finally returned to Venice in the year 1295, laden with wealth and with stories. Marco's account of his travels, dictated some years later while he was a prisoner of war in Genoa to a fellow prisoner named Rusticello of Pisa, was written down as a manuscript that would circulate throughout Europe under various titles, most commonly the Travels of Marco Polo or the Book of the Marvels of the World. It was, for medieval Europeans, an eye-opening document. And whether or not every detail of it is literally true, and there are scholars who have questioned various parts of it, the general picture it paints of a vast, wealthy, sophisticated Asia, connected by roads and rivers and administered by an intelligent central authority, was accurate in its broad strokes. Marco Polo's book would inspire, some 200 years later, a certain Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who carried a heavily annotated copy of it with him on his voyage westward across the Atlantic, hoping to reach the wealth of Cathay by a new route. But that is a story for another time. Marco Polo was not the only European to make the great journey east during the Pax Mongolica. He was simply the most famous, thanks to the enduring popularity of his book. There were others, and their stories, though less celebrated, are equally fascinating windows into that remarkable era when the roads of Asia lay open to any traveler with the courage and the resources to attempt them. Consider the case of William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan friar who was sent by King Louis IX of France on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court in the year 1253, some 2 decades before Marco Polo set off. William traveled from Constantinople across the steppes of southern Russia and eventually reached the great Mongol capital of Karakoram, deep in what is today Mongolia. His account of that city and of the diverse peoples he found gathered there is one of the most vivid documents to come down to us from the medieval world. He described a place where he encountered a French woman named Paquette, taken captive years earlier during the Mongol raids into Hungary, and now serving in the household of a Nestorian Christian queen. He described a Parisian goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher, who had been captured during the same campaigns and who had been set to work by the Great Khan to create a magnificent silver drinking fountain in the shape of a tree, from which 4 different beverages, wine, mare's milk, honey mead, and rice wine, would flow into vessels at the base whenever a mechanical angel at the top blew its trumpet. Imagine, if you would, the strangeness of it. A Parisian craftsman, taken from the streets of Buda, building a wine fountain for a Mongol emperor in the middle of the steppe. The Silk Road, at its zenith, brought together the most improbable combinations of people you could imagine. William also described religious debates held at the Mongol court, in which representatives of Islam, Nestorian Christianity, and Buddhism argued their respective positions before the great Khan monk, who listened with the tolerance and curiosity that was, in fact, characteristic of the early Mongol rulers. The Mongols themselves, at that time, followed a form of shamanism centered on the worship of the sky god Tengri, and they were remarkably indifferent to which of the major world religions their subjects preferred to practice, so long as those subjects prayed for the health and success of the great Khan. Later, the various branches of the Mongol Empire would convert to different faiths. The Ilkhanate, ruling in Persia, would eventually adopt Islam. The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, would develop a strong sympathy for Tibetan Buddhism. The Golden Horde in Russia would convert to Islam by the 14th century. But in the early days of the empire, this religious eclecticism was one of the reasons why so many diverse peoples were able to travel and live under Mongol rule with a considerable degree of freedom. The Pax Mongolica facilitated other kinds of transmission too, and some of these were far less benign than the spread of books and ideas. It was during the 14th century that the greatest disease disaster in human history traveled the length of the Silk Road, bringing catastrophe to civilizations at both ends of it. I am, of course, speaking of the Black Death. The bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, had been present in various rodent populations across Central Asia for a very long time, likely centuries. It circulated primarily among marmots and gerbils on the steppes, occasionally spilling over into human populations in small local outbreaks. What changed in the 14th century and what allowed the disease to explode into a full pandemic is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Some historians point to climate change, specifically to the beginnings of what is called the Little Ice Age, which may have altered the ecology of the steppes and driven infected rodents into closer contact with humans. Others point to the increased connectivity provided by the Mongol trade networks, which allowed pathogens to travel with unprecedented speed across enormous distances. Whatever the precise combination of causes, in the late 1330s and early 1340s, an outbreak of plague began to move westward from Central Asia, following the caravan routes and the postal roads that the Mongols had so carefully maintained. The disease reached the Crimea in the year 1346, where a Mongol army of the Golden Horde was besieging the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa on the Black Sea coast. The Mongols, according to a contemporary account, catapulted the plague-infected corpses of their own dead over the walls of the city, one of the earliest and most gruesome examples of biological warfare in recorded history. Whether this was actually the primary vector of transmission is debated by modern epidemiologists, who suspect that rats and their fleas moving between the two camps did most of the work. But whatever the mechanism, the Genoese defenders were soon dying too, and when the survivors abandoned the siege and fled by ship back to Italy, they brought the plague with them. By 1347, it was in Sicily. By 1348, it was ravaging Italy, France, and Spain. By 1349, it had reached England. By 1350, it was in Scandinavia, and it did not stop there. Some estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of the European population within a few short years. Similar catastrophes had already occurred or were occurring simultaneously at the eastern end of the Silk Road. Chinese sources from the mid-14th century record devastating outbreaks of disease that killed enormous numbers of people, though the specific identification of these outbreaks with the Black Death remains a subject of scholarly discussion. The Islamic world, too, was devastated. The great Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, who lost both his parents to the plague when he was a young man, wrote of a civilization that had been shaken to its foundations, of empty villages, of untended fields, of cities where the living could not bury the dead fast enough. The Pax Mongolica, which had facilitated so much creative exchange, had also, tragically, facilitated this. And the pandemic contributed, along with other factors, to the fracturing of the Mongol imperial system itself. The various branches of the empire had already been drifting apart politically for some decades. The plague and the economic dislocations that followed it accelerated that process. By the middle of the 14th century, the Yuan dynasty in China was in serious trouble, weakened by court intrigue, by rebellions, and by the general breakdown of the Mongol administration. In the year 1368, the Yuan were driven out of Beijing by a rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang, who founded the Ming dynasty and set China on a very different course from the one it had followed under the cosmopolitan Mongols. The Ming dynasty, particularly under its early emperors, was suspicious of foreigners and foreign influences in a way that was reminiscent of the late Tang. Trade continued, of course, but it was much more strictly regulated. The great cosmopolitan openness that had characterized Mongol-era China gave way to a more inward-looking imperial court. There would be one great exception to this in the early 15th century, and we shall come to it presently. But in general, the Ming era marked a turning away from the kind of overland engagement with the rest of Eurasia that had characterized the previous centuries. Meanwhile, in the West, the Ilkhanate had collapsed in the 1330s, and its former territories fragmented among various local dynasties and warlords. The Golden Horde continued to rule in Russia, but was itself weakening. And into this space of Mongol collapse there arose one last great steppe conqueror, one whose career was in many ways a deliberate echo of Genghis Khan's, though on a somewhat smaller scale. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur was born in the year 1336 near Samarkand, in what had been part of the Chagatai Khanate, another of the Mongol successor states. He was not himself a Mongol by descent, but a Turkic Muslim, and he claimed a somewhat tenuous connection to the Jenghisid dynasty through marriage. Beginning in the 1360s, he gradually built up a personal power base among the various tribal factions of Central Asia, and by the 1380s, he was launching campaigns of conquest that would eventually take him from India to Russia, from Anatolia to the borders of China. He sacked Delhi in 1398, killing so many of its inhabitants that, according to the chronicles, no birds could be heard singing in the ruined city for months afterward. He defeated and captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, briefly halting the Ottoman expansion and possibly delaying the fall of Constantinople to the Turks by half a century. And he was preparing an invasion of China itself when he died in early 1405 at the age of nearly 70 on the road eastward. Timur was, in many ways, a terrible destroyer. His campaigns are said to have killed millions of people. But he was also, paradoxically, a great patron of art and learning, and his capital at Samarkand became, during his reign and that of his successors, one of the most magnificent cities in the world. He brought skilled craftsmen from every corner of his conquests to Samarkand to build for him. Architects from Persia, tile workers from Baghdad, stone carvers from Syria, weavers from India. The result was an urban environment of astonishing beauty. The Registan, that great public square in Samarkand ringed by madrasas, the Bibi-Khanim Mosque, the Gur-Yamir, which is Timur's own tomb, these are all Timurid creations, and they represent the last great flowering of the classical Silk Road architectural tradition. Timur's grandson, Ulugh Beg, who ruled Samarkand in the mid-15th century, was one of the most remarkable rulers ever to sit on a throne anywhere. He was a serious astronomer who built one of the largest observatories in the pre-modern world, calculated the length of the year to within a minute or so of its true value, and produced a star catalogue that were still being consulted by European astronomers 300 years later. But Ulugh Beg's peaceful scholarly reign ended tragically, with his assassination in 1449 at the hands of his own son. And the Timurid dynasty entered a period of decline, though it produced one further offshoot of enormous historical importance. A great-great-great-grandson of Timur, a prince named Babur, would, after being driven from his Central Asian ancestral lands in the early 16th century, march south into India and there found the Mughal Empire, which would rule much of the subcontinent for the next 300 years. But that is a story that lies just beyond the closing frame of our Silk Road tale tonight. The 15th century, then, brings us to what many historians consider the beginning of the end for the classical Silk Road. But before we speak of endings, we should linger a while longer on one of the most remarkable episodes of that century, one that took place not on the overland routes at all, but on the seas. And it is worth telling, because it illuminates something important about the choices civilizations make, and about how the great highways of commerce can shift from land to water in ways that reshape the world. The story begins in the Ming imperial court in Beijing in the early years of the 15th century. The Ming had, as I mentioned, taken a somewhat suspicious view of foreigners, but the third Ming emperor, Yongle, who came to the throne in 1402 through a rather ugly civil war against his own nephew, was a man of enormous ambition. He wanted to demonstrate the power and majesty of the Ming dynasty to the whole known world, and he had at his court a remarkable man to help him do it. This was Zheng He, an admiral of Muslim background, born in Yunnan province in the far southwest of China, captured as a boy during the Ming conquest of that region, castrated, taken into imperial service as a eunuch, and gradually rising through his intelligence and ability to become one of the most trusted officials in the empire. Emperor Yongle chose Zheng He to command what would become the most extraordinary series of naval expeditions ever launched by any pre-modern state. Between the years 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 great voyages, sailing with fleets that included dozens, sometimes hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. The largest of his vessels, the so-called treasure ships, were said to have been over 100 meters in length, dwarfing any European ship that would sail for another 3 centuries. His fleets visited Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Malacca, Ceylon, the Malabar coast of India, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and the East African coast as far south as what is today Kenya. He brought back giraffes and zebras for the imperial menagerie, receiving these exotic animals with great ceremony and interpreting them, in one memorable case, as the mythical Qilin of Chinese legend, an auspicious sign that heaven approved of the Yongle emperor's reign. He established Chinese suzerainty over dozens of foreign kingdoms, at least in the diplomatic sense that their rulers agreed to send tribute missions to Beijing. And he demonstrated, more clearly than any other event of that century, that Chinese naval and maritime technology was, at that moment in history, the most advanced in the world. And then, quite suddenly, it all stopped. The Yongle emperor died in 1424. His successors were less enthusiastic about the expeditions, which were extremely expensive. Confucian officials at court argued that the voyages had achieved little of practical value, and that the money would be better spent on defense of the northern frontier against the resurgent Mongols. After Zheng He's 7th and final voyage in 1433, the great expeditions were discontinued. And in one of the more consequential decisions in world history, the Ming court ordered the treasure ships to be broken up and prohibited the construction of ocean-going vessels. The records of the voyages were, in some cases, deliberately destroyed by officials who considered them a distraction from proper governance. China turned its back on the sea, just at the moment when the sea was about to become the most important arena of world commerce and world power. Because at the very same time that China was withdrawing from the ocean, on the other side of Eurasia, in a small and rather peripheral corner of it, another civilization was beginning to look outward. Portuguese sailors, sponsored by their Prince Henry the Navigator, were creeping down the west coast of Africa, systematically probing further south with each expedition, gradually building up the geographical and navigational knowledge that would allow them, in the end, to circumnavigate the African continent and reach the Indian Ocean. In the year 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope. 10 years later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed all the way to Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, opening a direct sea route between Europe and Asia that had never existed before. And once that route was open, the maritime spice trade, which had for so long been controlled by Arab and Indian middlemen, began to shift decisively toward European hands. Portuguese trading posts and fortresses proliferated across the Indian Ocean. In the following century, they would be joined and then overtaken by the Dutch and the English. The consequences of these developments for the overland Silk Road were slow at first, but ultimately profound. Once European merchants could sail directly to the source of Asian goods, the necessity of trading through the great caravan networks of Central Asia diminished dramatically. Silk could be purchased in Guangzhou and loaded directly onto European ships. Spices could be obtained in Java and the Moluccas without any need for the ancient overland relay through Persia and Anatolia. The great intermediary role that had been played for centuries by the merchants of Samarkand and Bokhara and Kashgar was gradually and then completely undercut. The caravans continued to move for a long time yet, particularly for regional trade within Asia, but their global importance faded away. There were other factors at work too. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the West created a new imperial barrier between Europe and Asia. After the Ottomans captured Constantinople in 1453, the ancient overland route through Anatolia became subject to Ottoman customs and Ottoman politics in ways that European merchants often found frustrating. In Central Asia itself, the decline of the Timurid dynasty and the fragmentation of political authority made the roads less safe than they had been under the Pax Mongolica. In China, the Ming dynasty maintained a general policy of restricting foreign trade and foreign contact, punctuated only occasionally by the great outward gestures of the Zheng He era. In Persia, the rise of the Safavid dynasty in 1501 created a Shia Muslim state that was often at odds with its Sunni neighbors in Central Asia and Anatolia, complicating commerce across those borders. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Overland Silk Road had become a matter more of regional than of global importance. Bokhara and Samarkand were still functioning trading cities, and the caravans still crossed the deserts and mountains. But they were no longer, in any meaningful sense, the great pipeline of world commerce that they had once been. The story of Eurasian trade had shifted decisively to the oceans, and would remain there for the following several centuries, until the age of railways and eventually air travel would render both the overland and the maritime routes somewhat obsolete for many purposes. And yet, even as the great days of the Silk Road faded, the physical and cultural legacy of those 15 centuries did not disappear. It could not disappear. Too much had been transmitted, too many peoples had been shaped by contact along the road, for its influence simply to vanish. Buddhism was permanently established in China, in Korea, in Japan, in Vietnam. The Islamic world extended in an unbroken belt across the middle of Eurasia, from Morocco to the borders of China, a permanent legacy of the westward spread of Arab and Turkic Islam. Paper, gunpowder, printing, the compass, all these Chinese inventions had made their way westward and would, in due course, contribute to the transformation of European civilization. Sugar, cotton, and spices had shaped the diets and economies of the Mediterranean world. Persian art, Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, Central Asian carpets, all these things had established markets and tastes that would persist long after the caravans had stopped. And in a curious way, the memory of the Silk Road began to return with force in the modern era. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a series of European and American explorers began to travel through Central Asia in search of the lost cities and treasures of the ancient road. Sven Hedin, the Swedish explorer, made his famous crossings of the Taklamakan Desert. Aurel Stein, the Hungarian-British archaeologist, made 3 great expeditions between 1900 and 1916, during which he explored the sand-buried ruins of the southern Silk Road. And it was Stein, in the year 1907, who arrived at the Mogao caves of Dunhuang and made one of the most sensational discoveries of modern archaeology. A local Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu had, some years earlier, discovered a hidden chamber walled up behind a fresco in one of the caves. And inside that chamber, he had found something quite remarkable. Tens of thousands of manuscripts, paintings on silk, ritual objects, and printed texts, all of them dating from the 5th to the early 11th centuries, and all of them sealed inside that chamber around the year 1000 for reasons that scholars still debate. It may have been to protect them from an invasion. It may have been simply a library retirement. Whatever the reason, they had lain undisturbed for nearly 900 years in the dry desert air, and they had survived in extraordinary condition. Stein, negotiating carefully with Wang Yuanlu and giving him a substantial donation for the upkeep of the caves, was permitted to remove several thousand of these manuscripts and paintings, which he shipped to the British Museum. A French sinologist named Paul Pelliot arrived shortly afterward and selected many more of the highest scholarly value for the collections in Paris. Later, Japanese, Russian, and Chinese expeditions removed further material. The dispersal of the Dunhuang manuscripts across libraries and museums in London, Paris, St. Petersburg, Beijing, and Tokyo is one of the great scholarly scandals or great scholarly rescues of the 20th century, depending on your point of view. But whatever one thinks of the ethics of it, the manuscripts themselves have transformed our understanding of the medieval Silk Road, of Chinese Buddhism, of the languages of Central Asia, and of the daily life of the peoples who lived along the road. Among the treasures recovered from the Mogao caves, incidentally, was the Diamond Sutra of the year 868, which is the earliest known printed book bearing a definite date, printed nearly 600 years before Gutenberg's Bible in Europe. The road, in a very real sense, had not been forgotten. It had simply been buried, waiting to be found again. Section 1010. And so we come, at last, to the closing of our long journey together. We have traveled, in these few hours, across 15 centuries and half a continent, from the Han court of Emperor Wu to the Portuguese caravels rounding the Cape of Good Hope, from Zhang Qian's 10 years of Xingnu captivity to Aurel Stein's negotiations with a Taoist monk in the Gobi Desert. It is a great deal of ground to have covered, and I hope you have found the journey a peaceful one, whether you have been listening from the beginning or drifting in and out as sleep found you. Let us, before we close, take a moment to reflect on what all of this actually meant, because the Silk Road, though we speak of it as if it were a single thing, was really a great many things at once. It was a commercial network, yes, and an enormous one, but it was also something more difficult to name. It was a mechanism by which civilizations that would otherwise have remained separate reached out and touched one another, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, always consequentially. It was a channel by which ideas traveled and mutated and returned home unrecognizable. It was a set of physical places where extraordinary things happened, where a Parisian goldsmith could build a wine fountain for a Mongol emperor, where a Han diplomat could sit for 10 years in a Xingnu tent and never let go of his mission, where a wandering monk could see a vision of 1,000 Buddhas and begin to carve them into a cliff face that would still be teaching us new things a millennium and a half later. And more than anything else, perhaps, it was a series of relationships between human beings across enormous distances. The merchant in Chang'an did not know the woman in Rome who would eventually wear the silk he had woven. The scribe in Baghdad did not know the Chinese papermaker whose descendants had passed on the technique that made his career possible. The Buddhist pilgrim from India did not know the Chinese emperor who would, centuries later, come to worship the faith he had helped to plant. But all of these people were connected, whether they knew it or not, by the road. And that is, when you think about it, a rather lovely thing to consider. The world has always been more interconnected than the people living in any given moment tend to believe. Civilization is, in the end, a conversation across generations and continents, and the Silk Road was one of the most eloquent conversations that our species has ever conducted with itself. The routes themselves, of course, still exist. Modern Chinese initiative has, in recent decades, begun to speak of a new Silk Road, with railways and highways and pipelines running along many of the same corridors that the ancient camel caravans followed. Whether this modern version will prove as culturally consequential as its ancient predecessor is a question for future historians. But it is worth noting, I think, that the geographical logic of Eurasia has not fundamentally changed. The mountains and deserts and river valleys that channeled the ancient trade still channel modern trade. The great oasis cities of Central Asia, though many of them are today rather sleepy provincial towns compared to their medieval glory, still sit at the same crossroads they always did. And who knows what the next chapter will bring? Certain places, certain images, remain with us from this long story, and it is perhaps worth naming a few of them one last time, as a kind of farewell. Dunhuang, at the western gate of China, with its 500 painted caves cut into the desert cliff. Samarkand, gleaming with turquoise tiles under the sun of the Zeravshan Valley. Baghdad in its round city glory, with its libraries and its houses of wisdom. Chang'an, the largest city in the world, with its Sogdian merchants and its Nestorian priests and its Buddhist monks. Constantinople, the great door between Europe and Asia, watching centuries of goods pass through its gates. Venice, at the far end of the road, growing rich on the passage of Eastern luxuries through its lagoons. The Bamiyan Buddhas, standing in their cliff face for 1,500 years before being blown apart in a single afternoon. The Diamond Sutra, printed in the year 868, waiting in a sealed cave for 1,000 years to be found again. Marco Polo, dictating his memoirs in a Genoese prison. Zheng He, receiving a giraffe as tribute from an African king. Genghis Khan, dying on the road eastward, his death kept secret so his campaigns could be completed. Xuanzang, weeping for the manuscripts lost in a river crossing. These are the images that stay with us. And they stay with us not because they are exotic, though of course they are exotic, but because they are, in their strange way, familiar. They are stories about human beings doing what human beings have always done. Trading, traveling, believing, translating, fighting, building, remembering. The Silk Road is a mirror, if we care to look into it, of everything that our species has ever been. Now, as we close, I want to say one more thing about the nature of endings themselves, because the Silk Road, as I have been telling it tonight, ended in the 15th and 16th centuries when the sea routes took over from the land routes. And in one sense that is true, but in another sense, nothing really ends. The consequences of what happened along the road are still with us. Every time you drink a cup of tea, you are participating, distantly, in a trade that began on the Silk Road. Every time you handle a piece of paper or read a printed book, you are handling technologies whose transmission the road made possible. Every time you see a Chinese character on a menu, or hear an Arabic call to prayer, or see a Buddhist temple in San Francisco or in London, you are seeing the after effects of centuries of movement along those routes. History does not end. It just changes shape, and it settles into the deeper strata of the present. The Silk Road, in its own quiet way, made us who we are. It made China a Buddhist country. It made Central Asia an Islamic region. It gave Europe its paper and its gunpowder and its compass, without which the age of exploration could not have happened, and without which our modern world could not have arisen. It gave the Arabs their access to Greek philosophy, without which the Islamic Golden Age could not have flowered. It gave India its enduring cultural ties to Persia and Central Asia. It gave us Marco Polo and Xuanzang and Ibn Battuta and William of Rubruck, whose books still, all these centuries later, teach us how to see the world. It gave us the Mogao Caves, and the Bibi Khanim Mosque, and the Great Mosque of Zion, and countless other buildings and works of art that would not exist had the road not existed to bring their creators together. And so, we take our leave of the road tonight, not with a sense of loss, but with a sense of continuity. The camels no longer walk from Dunhuang to Samarkand in great caravans of 100 beasts and their bells. The Sogdian merchants no longer negotiate their prices in Kashgar in a dozen different languages. The pilgrim monks no longer wear out their sandals crossing the Pamirs in search of scriptures. But everything that they carried, everything that they transmitted, everything that they built, is still here with us. It is woven into the fabric of the world we live in, whether we notice it or not. I hope you have enjoyed our long walk together tonight. I hope that some of the stories have stayed with you, and that some of the images will return to you the next time you see a piece of silk, or a porcelain teacup, or a page of paper, or a spice on your kitchen shelf. All of these things have a history, and much of that history runs back, one way or another, to the Great Road across Asia. Now, let me thank the patrons and the YouTube supporters, because they are the reason there were no advertisements to interrupt our journey tonight. Their kind support is what keeps this channel going, and it is what allows me to spend the hours and hours it takes to research, and to write, and to narrate these long stories for you. To Kimberly, to Christine, to Sally, to Ember, to Susan, to Carrie, to Charlene, to Linda, to Katiana, to Nicholas, to Alexander, to Charles, to Aaron, to Jadden, to Jim, to Jeffrey, to Jessica, to Melissa, to Scott, to Wendy, to Josie, to Sarah, to Ryan, to Thor, to Cameron, to Stefan, to Kevin, to Crystal, to Anthony, to Brandon, to Lucy, to Nicholas, to Craig, to Alexander, to Benita, to Claire, to Carol, to Robert, to Mary, to Bridget, to Jennifer, to Brittany, to David, to Cody, to Brian, and to all the others whose names I have not mentioned, but whose support is felt every single day. Thank you. This is your channel as much as it is mine. And to you, if you have listened all the way through to the end, you have my particular gratitude. Not many people make it this far. Most drift off somewhere in the Tang dynasty or fall asleep during the Mongol invasions, which is entirely permissible, that being rather the point of a sleep documentary. But if you have made it all the way here to the end, why not leave a comment letting me know? Tell me your favorite moment from the journey. Tell me which city you would most like to visit if you could travel back in time. Tell me anything at all, because I do read them, and it is lovely to know that someone out there has walked the whole road with me tonight. As for me, I think I have earned a rest. The road has been long, and the hour is late. So I bid you a very good night, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you sit. Sleep well, dream well, and I will see you again when you feel like returning. You know where I will be, right here on YouTube. Good night and farewell. Peace.